Quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I'll start by recognizing myself and ranking member to present our opening statements. And without objection, the members of the subcommittee can submit their opening remarks for the record. Now I yield myself as much time as I may consume to present my opening statement. Good afternoon and welcome to this hearing to evaluate the North America Free Trade Agreement. About 20 years ago, we passed this, I think, wonderful piece of legislation and entered into this agreement. And just last month, the subcommittee held a hearing in my home state of Arizona on our commercial relationship with Mexico and what we can do to better facilitate the flow of commerce along our southern border. So today's hearing on NAFTA is an appropriate follow-up to that hearing, this time looking more broadly at our trade and investment relationships with both Canada and Mexico, the strengths and the weaknesses of NAFTA with 20 years behind us, and what needs to be done now to improve upon this agreement. I want to thank Chairman Royce for his leadership. I believe he'll be joining us at the hearing today. We had a little vote that interrupted everything on the floor, and I apologize to our panelists on a rule. Yes, and that, you know how important that is, the former Rules Chairman. It seems clear to me that America's leadership in promoting free trade policies has been an important, vital part of American prosperity. The level of competition created by free trade policies has been the impetus for remarkable innovation. While leading to the opening of exciting new markets around the world, at home this has allowed the American people to access more varied goods and services at lower prices, while creating jobs, a practical and positive effect for free trade that benefits every American. And American leadership in promoting free trade agreements globally has been instrumental in the spread of economic freedom and the rule of law worldwide, and has spurred unprecedented economic growth in the developing world. Indeed, free trade has proven to be the most important tool of U.S. foreign policy seeking to promote individual liberty and economic freedom around the world. The world isn't entirely free yet, but the message of economic freedom and the power of entrepreneurship is being spread to faraway corners of the globe thanks to American leadership and free trade. 20 years ago, NAFTA was a truly groundbreaking agreement, becoming the first regional trade agreement between two developed countries and a developing country. There was a lot of controversy surrounding NAFTA then, and even today it would be misleading to conclude that NAFTA was a perfect agreement. No trade agreement ever is. What it did do, though, was to integrate the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican economies, resulting in what today is a $19 trillion regional market. Indeed, figures from the United States Chamber of Commerce suggest that a combined total of 14 million U.S. jobs depend on trade with Mexico and Canada. Canada is the United States' largest export market and our most important supplier of energy. Meanwhile, it's worth noting that Mexico imports more U.S. goods than all of Latin America combined, and more than Brazil, China, India, and Russia combined. NAFTA reduced and eventually eliminated trade barriers, leading to a generation of impressive growth in trade and investment among the three countries. This resulted in production sharing made possible by proximity between the three economies by integrating and strengthening supply chains and key industries. What this means for the United States is that imports from Mexico contain 40% U.S. content, and imports from Canada can contain 25% U.S. content. By way of comparison, imports from China contain only 4% U.S. content. Despite the reassuring, promising numbers, we will likely hear from some of our witnesses. Now that NAFTA is 20 years old and all grown up, we have an obligation to take a critical look at the agreement and find ways to make it even better. I've always been a firm believer in free trade and positive effects of truly free trade. That's exactly why right now, as negotiations are underway to liberalize trade through Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, is exactly the right time to look at NAFTA, figure out where it helped U.S. businesses and commercial interests and the interests of American consumers and families, and where the agreement may have failed us. As we learned during our field hearing on trade facilitation with Mexico, 20 years into NAFTA should be the time we recommit our resources to border infrastructure by identifying new approaches to financing and commercial partnerships so we can make the investments necessary to make cross-border commerce more efficient and streamlined without neglecting legitimate security concerns. The U.S. should partner with and press Mexico to continue addressing the insecurity that plagues Mexico while reforming and updating its judicial system. While NAFTA certainly improved our commercial relationship with both Canada and Mexico, the treaty needs to be addressed. It needs to be able to address 21st century trade challenges. One of these challenges is intellectual property rights protection issues that persist with our Canadian neighbors. In 2013, the USTR designated Canada as a watch list country on its Special 301 report. This is a pending issue between our nations, and I hope we can resolve it soon to ensure that individuals and companies have transparent legal avenues to ensure ownership and profits for their innovations. Further, it's important to note that there is only political support for these trade and investment agreements as long as people follow the rules and the rights of innovators and investors are protected. It's notable that the North American energy independence and security was conspicuously absent from original NAFTA negotiations. At the time, Mexico had a constitutionally closed energy regime, making its inclusion impossible. Today, Mexico is engaged in implementing serious energy reform that will open its energy sector to foreign investment through a constitutional amendment they recently passed, promising to increase Mexican oil production and make North American energy independence a reality. Sadly, today, the roadblock to realizing energy security and independence in North America has been put up by the Obama administration right here in the United States. I once again call on the administration to finally approve the Keystone XL pipeline, which would be a job creator and an important part of our energy security for this country. Continued obstruction not only threatens the environment as less secure modes of transportation are utilized, but it sends a negative message to our Canadian partners and allies. I want to thank Ambassador Carla Hills and my friend, former Congressman David Dreyer, for testifying on our first panel, and Mr. Eric Farnsworth, Mark Elliott, and Dr. Duncan Wood for joining us on the second panel to discuss the North American Free Trade Agreement, the accomplishments, the challenges, and the way forward. I look forward to a productive hearing. Would now recognize the chairman of the full committee, if that's all right with you.
I think we should go to Mr. Series.
Is that okay? Let's go to Mr. Series then.
Thank you.
You bet.
No problem. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. It has been 20 years since the North American Free Trade Agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada came into force. The trade agreement was a staggering in scope and spurred vigorous and contentious debates in each country and houses of government. Proponents predicted the creation of countless U.S. jobs alongside the deterrence of foreign, undocumented immigrants. Opponents, on the other hand, foresaw the opposite. The agreement aimed to eliminate virtually all tariff on trade between partner countries over a 15-year period. In the process, NAFTA created the largest trade bloc in the world of its kind. Ultimately, although the agreement has served as a template for subsequent trade agreements, NAFTA has not lived up to the entirety of expectation espoused by its advocates, nor has it resulted in the catastrophic losses predicted by its opponents. There is no denying that in terms of trade alone, NAFTA has achieved impressive indicators. U.S. trade with NAFTA countries has more than tripled to over $1 trillion a year. Trade barriers have been eliminated, supply chains enhanced, opportunities for investments increased, and mechanisms for trade dispute resolutions were established. In 1993, the U.S. trade has increased over 500% with Mexico and over 190% with Canada. The United States is Mexico's largest trading partner and the largest foreign investor. Mexico, in turn, is the third largest U.S. trading partner after Canada. Together, Mexico and Canada accounted for 32% of total U.S. exports in 2012. These statistics are telling, but they speak little of the broader implication least accentuated by the agreement. NAFTA was comprehensive but far from complete, let alone harmless. For one, labor and environmental provisions were both weak and separate from the core of the agreement. Additionally, there has been little convergence in terms of economic growth, income disparity, job creation, and regulations. in part because the agreements attempted to integrate two advanced developed countries with a developing country that was ill ready to absorb the collateral damage of trade liberalization. This was especially true for Mexico, whose NAFTA advocates hoped the agreement would help them export goods, not people, when in fact the opposite occurred. As Mexico shifted away from agriculture, rural populations were pulled northward because of the weak job creations in Mexico and the demand for migrant workers in the United States. Meanwhile, in Canada and the United States, job losses were numerous in sectors such as manufacturing, as the new economic model exposed firms to greater competition. On the other hand, NAFTA cannot take sole responsibility for the various changes in trade, labor environment, or various economic occurrences that have taken place amongst partner countries since 1994. Unforeseen global events like the 9/11 terrorist attack and the global financial crisis of 2008 played a role. For Canada and the U.S., the agreement enhanced an already existing free trade accord, while for Mexico, the agreement provided an international treaty mechanism to solidify and expand existing domestic reforms. Today, there's talk of revisiting the agreement. The human and the economic costs are far too great to ignore this task. Tensions remain between border security and trade facilitation that affect the flow of goods, services, and people across the border. Of particular concern to me and countless New Jersey-based life science companies is Canada's unfortunate record of protecting intellectual properties through its discriminatory use of the so-called Promise Doctrine. The doctrine stipulates that the utility of a patent must be first demonstrated or predicted at the time of the patent application. This makes it easier for generic companies to challenge the usefulness of a patent drug and ultimately launch a parallel generic brand. This case is not just a matter of fairness, but about more than 50,000 workers employed by 1,700 New Jersey-based life science companies that have invested more than $8.7 billion in research and development and created more than 72,000 jobs, spin-off jobs in New Jersey, and contributed nearly $27 billion to the New Jersey economy in 2012. That trade is economic reality of globalization does not justify ignoring unintended and direct consequences on the environment, workers, and private enterprise. As stewards of the world's largest economy, it is our duty to be mindful of this reality as future agreements come to the forefront. At the same time, lesser developed countries must recognize that large trade agreements are not substitute for national development policies. 20 years on the NAFTA have made it clear that the agreement was both oversold and greatly underestimated. Furthermore, assessing the agreement's impact as an outright success or failure is far too narrow and simplistic. I look forward to hearing from our panelists, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Royce.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Simon, I just want to thank you for the field hearing you held recently and for chairing this today. A very successful field hearing, and it's a pleasure to see my former colleague, David Dreyer, who did so much on the issue of advancing trade, along with our very successful former trade representative, Carla. It's good to see you, Ambassador, here with us as well. I think there is a great potential for increased trade in this hemisphere, and within North America, I think we could do a lot to boost our exports and increase jobs here, and not only in North America, as a matter of fact, but also in the Pacific as well. We have a key destination there for manufacturing goods from the U.S. All along that rim of the Pacific, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, I think, is important to that end. I think, and this was the subject of Mr. Salmon's hearing, but I think that requiring better management across our borders is key to some of this, and our business group reports that risk management, improvements in infrastructure, a focus on travel and trade facilitation, that this can have a sort of symbiotic advantage in advancing not only our economic interests, but also protecting our security interests at the same time. I think repairing and upgrading ports that have become a little dilapidated, a little deteriorated, closing underutilized facilities, extending the hours of overcrowded entry points. All of these things can, I think, assist and frankly are absolutely necessary. So today the United States is overtaking Russia in terms of our capacity at energy production, top oil and gas producing nation in the world in short order here, I think. And Canada and Mexico are our top sources of importation of petroleum at this time into the U.S. So clearly the other issue here is greater energy cooperation with our neighbors, which, again, our goal at the end of the day is to have the cheapest energy costs in the world, not to have our economic competitors have that advantage. And so the affordability and availability of natural gas has the potential here of revolutionizing North American manufacturing. As you drop that cost down, it's amazing how energy has become, in many ways, the most important component. Energy and labor are the most important components now for light manufacturing. And today, the U.S., I think, has an opportunity also with Canada. Since 2008, the Canadians have been pushing hard on an agreement that has been on the President's desk for the Keystone XL project. The Canadians are not going to wait around forever, and they've made it clear to us. The pipeline is going to be built. The question is whether it goes south or whether it goes west. And if it goes west, that oil is going to be shipped to our economic competitor, China. They are going to develop that resource one way or the other. And I think further delays on the final decision at Keystone will probably mean that the U.S. will be the loser in this, and we will have lower energy costs eventually coming out of from our economic competitor, who will be the beneficiary of the fact that we've turned down something that economically made all the sense in the world. Since I think the ratio is about 3/4 of what Canadians spend with the profits end up to buy manufactured goods from the United States. They're on our border. I mean, you think about the issues with respect to energy security. All of this demands our focus on Mexico and Canada here with respect to energy going forward. So I thank you all, and again, I thank the Chairman for conducting this hearing today. Mr. Sears, thank you, too, for your engagement on these issues.
Thank you. Thank you. Chair will recognize Mr. Meeks for a brief statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. Over the years, I've worked with many of today's witnesses on finding ways to make pending U.S. trade agreements increasingly stronger. And in that regard, my friend and former colleague, David Dreyer, was certainly an able partner. It is good to see him and all of you here today. And today I hope we can combine a look back at NAFTA with a look ahead at how we might enhance the gains and learn from any mistakes. A couple of years ago, the Center for Global Development released a paper with the title, "Why is Opening the U.S. Market to Poor Countries So Hard?" In posing that question, the CGD highlighted the role that trade has played globally in lifting millions of people out of the ranks of poverty. I mention that question on this occasion because I want to start by noting a very important but often overlooked point in the debate about NAFTA's success or failure. The agreement was between two developed and one developing nation at a time when that was not a popular nor easy thing to do. If it is still challenging today to get developed nations to enter into meaningful trade agreements with developing nations, then certainly doing so 20 years ago was monumental. President Clinton was courageous in championing what he knew would be difficult but important trade deal for America. NAFTA was good for Mexico at a time when its economy and democracy was tumultuous. The agreement was forward-looking for the United States. We had a choice. We could have sat back as a nation and yielded to the controversy and opposition to NAFTA, but we chose instead to go ahead of globalization trend. So we solidified rules of trade with two critical trading partners, and in so doing ensured that we would have a fair chance to increase the exporting of U.S. goods and import in ways that would enhance our production and international supply chain. While there are winners and losers in any trade relationship and economic shift, NAFTA did not turn out to be the great job killer that opponents expected, nor did it do as much as some of the enthusiasts expected. Lastly, let me just pivot for a few points that are particularly important to me as a representative from the state of New York. Since 1993, New York exports of merchandise to NAFTA countries have grown by 123%. Merchandise exports from our state to Canada were at $15.4 billion in 2012 alone. These numbers demonstrate why New York is one of the 40 states that hold Mexico or Canada as their top trading partner. When I consider the totality of circumstances, I am convinced that both critics and enthusiasts made NAFTA better and continue to force improvements in the way we negotiate trade agreements. As I see it, TPP and TTIP are important opportunities to build upon the lessons of NAFTA. And I look forward to the perspective of our panelists and look forward to continuing to work with you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7, the members of the subcommittee will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 7 days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'd like to introduce the first panel. Ambassador Hills is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Hills & Company, International Consultants. She also served in the cabinets of President George H.W. Bush as the United States Trade Representative and of President Gerald R. Ford as Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Currently, she serves as a member of the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. She graduated from Stanford University and obtained her law degree from Yale Law School. Next, I would like to introduce David Dreyer. During his more than 3 decades of congressional service, Mr. Dreyer was a champion of enhanced trade liberalization between the U.S. and all of its global partners, but especially its North American neighbors. He introduced the first legislation calling for NAFTA and worked closely with Presidents Bush and Clinton throughout its negotiation and passage through Congress. To help make the case for deepening ties with Canada and Mexico, he formed the House Trade Working Group, which not only was instrumental in the passage of NAFTA, but continued to be a driving force in ushering every subsequent trade agreement through the House, including CAFTA and the FTAs with Colombia and Panama. He's the chairman of Annenberg-Dreyer Commission, which seeks to foster deeper connections and economic growth in nations of the Pacific Rim, including North, Central, and South America, Asia, and the Greater Pacific. And so with that, I'd like to recognize Ambassador Hills. But before I do recognize you, I'm going to explain the lighting system in front of you. You'll each have 5 minutes to present your oral statement. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have a minute left, the light will turn yellow. When your time has expired, the light will turn red. Ask that you conclude your testimony once the red light comes on. After our witnesses testify, all members will have 5 minutes to ask questions. And I urge my colleagues to stick to the 5-minute rule to ensure that all members get the opportunity to ask questions. Ambassador.
Thanks, members of the committee. It's an honor for me to appear before you, and particularly with David Dreyer, former chairman of the House Rules Committee and one of the greats who served this body. His efforts were instrumental in securing the approval of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA. And as noted, it was the first comprehensive free trade agreement to join developing and developed countries. It achieved broader and deeper market openings than any prior trade agreement negotiated anywhere in the world. And as a result, economic activity among the three nations exploded. Today, Canada is America's single largest export market. More than 8 million jobs depend upon our exports to Canada. And Mexico is our second single largest export market, and some 6 million U.S. jobs depend on our trade with Mexico. Over the past 2 decades, a highly efficient and integrated supply chain has developed among the three North American economies. More than $2 billion worth of goods and services cross our northern border every single day, and while roughly $1 billion per day crosses our southern border. Specialization has boosted productivity in all three economies. We not only sell things to each other, we make things together. And quite remarkably, for every dollar of goods that our two neighbors sell to us, there are 25 cents worth of U.S. inputs in the Canadian goods and 40 cents in the Mexican goods. By way of comparison, with respect to our imports from China, that's 4 cents. And most of those who have complained about the NAFTA focus on Mexico, but the economic data proves that having Mexico as a NAFTA partner has served U.S. interests extremely well. Last year, roughly 14% of our total exports went to Mexico, and as the chairman pointed out, that's more than all of our sales to the rest of Latin America. NAFTA, our exports to Mexico have grown 2 times faster than our trade to the rest of the world, and that's true of Canada as well. Although some contend that the NAFTA has depressed wages, a recent study by economists at Yale and our Federal Reserve concluded that wages, when adjusted for inflation, have actually risen as a result of the NAFTA in all 3 countries. And it is widely agreed that the NAFTA's market opening increased jobs connected to exports, which pay between 15% and 20% more than jobs that are purely domestically focused. With 116 million consumers and a purchasing power of over $1 trillion, Mexico offers significant opportunity to U.S. entrepreneurs, large and small, but smaller enterprises in particular benefit from Mexico's proximity and openness to our trade, because Mexico purchases about 11% of the exports from small and medium-sized businesses, which account for more than half of our nation's job creation. In short, the NAFTA has made our region one of the most competitive in the world, but the rest of the world has not stood still. Increasingly, trade agreements where the United States is not a party give entrepreneurs from other countries preferential access to key markets that our entrepreneurs don't have. And there are a number of actions that we could take, the building on the NAFTA platform, that would create new commercial opportunity, cut costs, and create jobs. And let me mention quickly just 3. First, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In 2012, Mexico and Canada joined the United States and 8 other nations to negotiate the TPP to link Asia and Pacific. There are 8 bilateral trade agreements between the 3 NAFTA governments and the other TPP participants that were negotiated after we negotiated the NAFTA. Their differences in rules of origin and custom procedures add cost to our trade, which could be dealt with in the TPP. Second, the Pacific Alliance is an ongoing trade negotiation initiated by Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Chile in 2011. Last year, Costa Rica gained approval to join. Mexico and Canada are observers along with 7 other nations. Canada and the United States, having them join the alliance, could eliminate costly regulatory differences among the 3 nations. And thirdly, a North American-European trade agreement. Last year, the United States and the European Union's 28 states launched a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Our average tariffs are quite low. The real potential for boosting economic growth will come from reducing the maze of regulatory standards covering a long list of goods and services. Enlarging this agreement to include our 2 neighbors, which already have separate trade agreements with the European Union, would greatly reduce costs and complexity of trade. Of course, the infrastructure is a very big issue. The United States could address that. I'm grateful to the chairman and members of the committee for the opportunity to share my thoughts on the NAFTA and moving forward and how we can build upon it. And so I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Mr. Dryer. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was talking to one of our great diplomats yesterday who, when I said I was going to be testifying with Carla Hills before your subcommittee, Mr. Chairman, He described her as a force of nature. And not long ago, I was talking to someone else about Carla Hills, and this woman said, she is a national treasure. You didn't have everything in that introduction. She was the first woman to be Secretary of the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the fourth woman to serve in a president's cabinet, and she has roots in California, which, even though I no longer represent California, I am always pleased to be in her presence. And I will say that when I think back about my involvement, I was little more than a foot soldier in the George H.W. Bush, Carla Hills, Bill Clinton, Mickey Cantor struggle to make sure that we succeeded with the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's particularly poignant for me, Mr. Chairman, to be here, and I will say that I don't have too many regrets of my service, but one of them was that I wasn't able to serve with you again. I campaigned with you in the last election, I know, but I worked closely with you on this issue of trade, and I know you feel passionately and strongly about it, and I appreciate that, but I'm sorry we weren't able to serve together. I also have to say that it's great to see Mr. Series. As I said in the ante room, we worked very closely on the Colombia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and I appreciated his activism and support there. And also I want to say that I appreciate the concerns that he raised in his opening statement as well. And Gregory Meeks has been my partner in crime for a long period of time on virtually every trade agreement, and he has stepped up, often facing criticism within his party, and he has done it because he knows and believes it's the right thing to do. And I have to say to Mr. Duncan and Mr. DeSantis and Mr. Regal, it's nice to see you all, and I hope very much that you will focus attention on this issue because it is so important. I have to say, Mr. Chairman, this is the first time that I've been back to the U.S. Capitol since January 2nd of last year, which is when I had the opportunity to manage the floor debate for the special rule on the fiscal cliff legislation. And by virtue of being the floor manager, I took the opportunity to offer some advice. And that's why it's particularly poignant for me to be invited to be here on this occasion, because in the last speech that I gave on January 2nd, the day before Ambassador Hill's birthday, I will say that I talked about the need for bipartisanship, and I talked about the issue of trade as creating a very unique and important opportunity for us to do just that. And that's why I'm very gratified to see that while we had this bipartisan effort put together with President George H.W. Bush and President Clinton, and as I said, Ambassador Hills and Ambassador Mickey Cantor, and others within both administrations who worked very strongly on this, I'm particularly pleased to see that we are today working for a broader bipartisan effort on this. And I want to congratulate Chairman Royce for the very strong statement that he made in support of something that we have yet to discuss, and that is Trade Promotion Authority. It seems to me that as we look at the imperative of moving ahead with all of these agreements, it's going to be absolutely essential that we give the President of the United States the opportunity to negotiate. Now, I know there's some who've raised concerns about Trade Promotion Authority, believing it's somehow this transfer of power to the President. When Carla Hills was United States Trade Representative, I will tell you that during the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement, she did because she understood the imperative of consulting with the United States Congress. And she did that consistently. And other USTRs have done that as well. Why? Because they know that this institution has the power to vote yes or no on those agreements. And so I do believe that moving ahead with TPA and maintaining the right that the Congress has to defeat a bad agreement is clearly there, although I believe that virtually any opportunity that we can reduce the barriers to the free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people is a very important thing for us to do. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, for the last year, I have had the opportunity to chair a commission. I'm happy that Ambassador Hills serves on the advisory board along with Mac McClarty and John Huntsman and Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright of our commission, which really grew from the vision that Ambassador Walter Annenberg had. When Ambassador Hills was negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ambassador Annenberg was sitting at his home at Sunnylands, and he was talking about the fact that the future is around the Pacific. Mr. Chairman, nearly two-thirds of the global GDP and nearly two-thirds of the global population is around the Pacific. And by virtue of that, I truly believe, and you as a Westerner understand that, as opposed to these guys from Jersey and New York, understand full well that that is, in fact, the wave of the future. We have a tendency here in New York and Washington to focus across the Atlantic. We have a wide range of entities that do that. And it's true, TTIP will, in fact, be the largest free trade agreement in the history of the world, but I suspect that TPP may be completed before it, and until TTIP is put into place, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now that Japan is part of that, will be the largest free trading bloc in the history of the world. It seems to me that that vision that was put forth by Walter Annenberg is one that was very, very prescient, and I'm pleased to be utilizing his estate at Sunnylands for a wide range of meetings. The presidents of China and the United States met there last summer, and I'm hoping very much that we'll be able to do things like include leaders within the Pacific Alliance there. And so I have lots of things that I could go through. I want to talk about the changes that have taken place in Mexico. One figure I was just given yesterday is that you know that as we look at the new Mexico, yes, poverty and the disparity in income levels is a very important thing, but Mexico now is part of a very important partnership on the Learjet, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. All countries involved in that process. And guess what? Mexico last year graduated more engineers than the United States of America did. And so this perception of Mexico is one that needs to change. And I think that as we mark this 20th anniversary, Mr. Chairman, it's very, very important for us to do everything we can to focus on how we can address these concerns. The answer to the problems of NAFTA is more NAFTA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dreyer. Ambassador Hills, I've received a surprisingly large number of calls from many organizations and companies expressing concerns with Canada's inconsistent IPR protection and enforcement. As you may know, last year Canada remained on USTR's watch list because many American companies still face legal uncertainty during the administrative process to obtain IPR protection. How can we confront the issue, and how can we ensure that our trading partner doesn't institutionalize bureaucratic barriers for our companies? I'm also concerned that some of the worst offenders of IPR violations globally would be India and China. And how do we stress to them the importance of fixing those problems if a developed nation such as Canada continues to deal with our IPR issues in the manner that it does? I think I'm a strong supporter of NAFTA, but I think this is an issue we've got to address because it's hurting a lot of our companies that are doing business in Canada.
I agree that intellectual property protection is absolutely essential. We're on the upscale in terms of our production. But even in great families, you have differences. And we do have differences with Canada as they do with us. The remedy is to sit down and work through it. It is certainly made easier by reason of having a trade agreement that sets out the rules so that you have a mechanism of addressing and getting a solution to the rules. So we have a lot of positive, many, many more positive with our first largest trading partner, their single largest, and some negatives, and they have a few complaints about us.
I'm sure that's true. I think we'd like to explore any and all opportunities because I think globally it's more important than just our bilateral relationship. I think it pretends to influence a lot of our other relationships on IPR with other nations. Mr. Dreyer, did you want to comment?
Well, the only thing that I would add to that is that we have a process in place to deal with this, and that was really part of this whole negotiation. And you know, when you are dealing with countries and businesses that want to remain on the cutting edge, there's going to be a lot of competition, and they're going to do everything they possibly can to ensure that that takes place. Ambassador Hills is absolutely right. The imperative of focusing on the rights of property is a very, very important thing. And I will say, she and I were just discussing earlier today, that as nations become more innovative and creative, and as they develop patents themselves, and we were talking about the fact that in China we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of patents being, if intellectual property is developed there, you're going to see a greater degree of responsibility take place.
It seems like, I mean, in a nutshell, what's happening is, and I've heard it probably more associated with some of our pharmaceutical companies, that go over there and the generic companies appeal, the process, saying that they haven't really lived up to everything they promised to deliver, and so the patents should be invalidated, and they should be able to go ahead and come in and take over those patents in the generic form. As I've talked to some of my friends from Canada, they say, well, that's going through the courts. But I think there are two opportunities maybe that we're going to have to look at. One is, I think Canada could address it through their legislative process to make sure that is clarified and that IPR protection is paramount to them as it is to us. And then secondly, there's always the possibility of we hate to do it, but filing a claim, and I don't want to rule that out. One last question, and that is dealing with energy. I'm as excited as I can be to see what's happening in Mexico right now, and them making the constitutional changes to allow investment from foreign oil companies and foreign partners, and I think it's going to do dramatic things to provide energy for the entire continent. But one of the things that kind of seems stymied still is the XL pipeline. And I know that our friends from Canada are very, very concerned about the length of time where we've been dragging our feet. Any thoughts from either of you on what we should do to move forward on that? The XL pipeline itself.
Well, I'm on record. When I served here, clearly I am very supportive of proceeding with the XL pipeline, and for all the reasons that have been stated, to me it's very obvious and apparent, and I think it's also something that can help us in our relationship with Canada. As you know, Mr. Chairman, next month Prime Minister Harper will be meeting with Presidents Obama and Peña Nieto, and I think that this will clearly be a topic of discussion, I suspect. And I also want to say that as we look at this overall issue, I want to congratulate Secretary Kerry for the very strong speech that he delivered at the Organization of American States recently, in which he talked about this expansion and of our trade relationship within this hemisphere. I think it's an important and a very positive sign of this administration's desire to move forward on it, and I hope that the XL pipeline will be part of that process.
Well, thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Sears.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Intellectual property is one of the big issues for me. Obviously, coming from a pharmaceutical state like New Jersey, we consider ourselves the medicine cabinet of America. So many jobs, but it seems like this barrier in Canada is just one. We seem to get China hacks into our computers, try to steal our property. Russia does the same thing. All these other countries, seems that our companies here in this country are bombarded with people trying to steal our research and trying to steal. And then you come to a friend, which I consider Canada to be, and then we have this barrier, which seems very silly, on pharmaceuticals, when it has been proven already to be useful, and they come up with generics. I don't know if the courts are ever going to solve this. I think we have to take, firmer steps to get them moving in the direction where they can set some standards so we can really put this beside us and go on to the next issue. Because one of the issues that I have with the South Korean trade agreement was the intellectual properties, of our companies. So I was just wondering, with NAFTA, what are some of the things that we could improve on that maybe we didn't look at in terms of intellectual properties and other factors? What did we miss? in this. Don't tell me you
Let me before Ambassador Hill proceeds, let me just defend her a little bit. And let's look at the time frame of this. We're marking the 20th anniversary. Think about where we as a world were 20 years ago. Where was the Internet 20 years ago? I read Eric Farnsworth's testimony. He underscores that in his remarks. It was virtually non-existent. Now, obviously, the pharmaceutical industry existed, but the kinds of advances that have been made in the last 2 decades have been monumental as well. And I think that it's important to note that to say that things were missed or there were mistakes that are made, most of this has been what has taken place in the 2 decades that have followed the passage and implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I think one of the important things that needs to be done as we look at negotiations for the future, and I've argued this for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's to have a degree of fluidity and flexibility so that as other countries are able to meet certain guidelines and standards, that they can become part of these agreements as well. And so I think that one of the important things that needs to be done is to not be too rigid within the structure. So I just say that partially in defense of Ambassador Hills. And
when I say that, I mean because I want it to move forward and be better.
Right, absolutely.
I don't want it to just
right,
end it right there.
Well, let me say that the agreement at the time provided the highest level of patent, trademark, copyright, trade secret protection that had been negotiated anywhere. And as David Dreyer has just stated, a lot of change has taken place. So we can enhance those rules through the mechanism of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. We've got 3 mega agreements that we could address and strengthen the rules. But why not sit down at the leaders' meeting with Canada and talk about how this erodes the partnership? And I do believe that our northern and southern neighbors would like to join, for example, the transatlantic agreement. But if we have differences that create friction, it'll be difficult to pull that off. And so talking about it, working your way through it, and trying to get the rules to cover good intellectual property of pharmaceuticals, which is primarily the problem in Canada. I think it can be done, but it can't be ignored.
Let me just add, if I could, that I think that Ambassador Hills raises a very important point, and that is my personal view as we look at TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, that the idea of doing a U.S.-European Union free trade agreement is a nice start, but by virtue of the fact that we've had so much success with the North American Free Trade Agreement, I'm one who believes that the idea of making this a NAFTA EU free trade agreement would actually be much more beneficial to both our country and to the hemisphere and the global economy as well. And so I would hope very much that we'd have the chance to move forward in that area.
And I fully agree with this. I think we actually will diminish our gains if we don't do that. And that is because we are unique in North America. As I said, we not only sell things to one another, we make things together. And our markets are so interlinked that 40 cents of every product that we import is U.S. contained. If we have different rules of origin with Europe, this simply won't work. It'll destroy the NAFTA platform that has given us so much, and the statistics that the chairman mentioned about the gains that we've already achieved. So this is an imperative, and I hope that Congress takes a good hard look at it.
Well, I don't want to beat up on Canada too much, but the chairman and I are working on a bill to extend the amount of time Canada can stay in this country from 6 to 8 months. So
thank you.
We work on that.
Good. Thanks. The chair recognizes Mr. Radel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regardless of some of the positions I've found my own self in life, I've always been the eternal optimist. And as we look at NAFTA free trade and some of the very real effects that it's had on people and their jobs, there have been incredibly positive things that have come. Big picture things that both Democrats and Republicans cannot deny and can agree on to move forward. National security. just an easy one. When you've got a good working relationship with people, you're going to have a solid relationship to move forward and not have any stresses or a strenuous relationship moving forward. The other issue here, too, as we talk about countries, even more specifically south of us, is the hot topic of immigration. No one can deny one of the best ways to solve an illegal immigration problem in the United States is to make sure men and women coming from other countries can put food on their kids' plate. And the best way to do that is to be able to provide economic security, jobs, and that's exactly what we've been able to do for years with this. And I commend you both for your work on this. Just some general questions. What more can the federal government do to help facilitate shared manufacturing production? Ambassador, you put it right. We make things together. What more can we do to provide more of that certainty and stability to keep this and to move forward in more free trade around the world?
It's already been mentioned that the infrastructure going north and south is poor, and sometimes the truck bringing that component part that we need to be globally competitive is held up at the border, not for just an hour, but sometimes many hours. And they come to the border, and as you know, they have to unload, get a lorry, take it across the border, put it on, so it has 3 trucks, in effect, that have to carry this component that our manufacturers are waiting for. This is a cost in terms of time. This is a cost in terms of money. And that makes us less competitive for those markets that don't have that extra cost. Because of Mexico and Canada's proximity to us, that makes us more competitive, so that when lower-cost countries in Asia, for example, seek to compete, they have a transportation cost. Well, we're adding a transportation complexity cost that could be avoided. So we ought to give some thought to that, have a real plan for how we address it. We perhaps, at least in my view, have been remiss on how we've handled the trucking issue with Mexico. And if we expect other nations to adhere to agreements, then, of course, we must too.
Let me just add to that. Thank you, Mr. Rigel. That The Economist had an interesting piece on NAFTA at 20 in which they pointed, as we all do with great regularity, at September 11th of 2001. Very, very sadly, what happened on September 11th played a big role in undermining the ability to deal with the immigration issue. It exacerbated the tension at our borders. And I think that obviously border security is critically important. And it's something that needs to be addressed. And I always argued when I was privileged to serve in this House that the number one responsibility of the federal government is our nation's security. So we can't forget that. We also know that with these agreements, it's important for us to realize the fact that infrastructure has to be improved. I was very concerned about the trucking issue, as Ambassador Hills has said, and I think that we need to do everything that we can to make it as easy as possible for this free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people to take place. We have so many opportunities to work together. We all, in our freshman economics class in college, learned the economic theory of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage says we do what we do best. And The Economist underscored the Bombardier Learjet example of Pratt & Whitney designing the aircraft here, the assembling taking place in Wichita, and in Querétaro, Mexico, we saw manufacturing take place, obviously at a company that is now owned by Canada. The only thing done outside of this hemisphere is done in Ireland, and that's the wing manufacture. And so if you look at the market itself is going to play a role in determining what Canada, the United States, and Mexico will do, and I have a great deal of confidence in it.
Agreed 100%. With my time winding down, just once again, thank you both so much, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for calling this.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I enjoy listening to you and couldn't agree more on many of the points that you have raised. You know, and as we enter into negotiations for TPA, which we have to figure out in a bipartisan way to pass, and then dealing with TPP and TTIP, all very important. Oftentimes I ask, you know, we see that nations, other nations, are entering into trade agreements. And I think, as the ambassador indicated, if we either get in the game and negotiate and have our own trade agreements or be a part of it, like TPP, or which will, I think, elevate standards, our standards, because if we stay on the sideline and let them negotiate with China, for example, or others, then you could expect that those standards will be lower and not the high standards that we set in our trade agreements. So I think it becomes tremendously important for us. Basically, and I think it's exactly what Mr. Dreyer has indicated, the fact that 20 years ago, so much have changed. There's been so much, the economy and technology is so different today than it was 20 years ago, and the world is so much smaller today than it was 20 years ago. It becomes that much more important for us to engage. That being said, we've got to figure out here how to make sure that we do it in a bipartisan way and understand that actually when you look at most of the trade agreements, it changes our trade deficit. Our trade deficit goes down because markets that had not been open to us, where we could not sell our goods that were made in America, now are open so that we can sell those goods to those individuals. That's where, in fact, the majority of the buyers are. So if we're going to expand, it has to be outside of the borders of the United States of America. And that's why that becomes so important. So all that to say now, in trying to do a bipartisan deal and trying to work collected together, there was what I believe was a groundbreaking trade compromise known as the May 10th Agreement, in which there was significant update and change for, I believe, in a better way that we negotiate trade pacts. So my first question to you is, do you think that the May 10th deal addresses many of the concerns that some, rightly or wrongly, you know, when people talked about NAFTA, because you still hear NAFTA as if it was something that was drafted yesterday and not something that you could build upon. But, right, you know, do you think that it addressed some of those concerns? And how can we build upon that, which I think that will help us go into the direction of, well, this shouldn't be an issue. This shouldn't be a Democrat or Republican issue. This is an issue that's important for the United States, whether you're Democrat or Republican.
I agree with you that trade is absolutely vital. If you look at what is the fuel for our economic growth today, trade is essential. And the Trade Promotion Authority is extremely important. It's not only important because of the division in our government, where you have power over trade and finance, but the president has negotiating power. Our trading partners don't want to sit at the table with us and put their tough political issues on the table unless they know that the agreement is fairly going to be voted up or down. If the agreement is not a good one, vote it down. But if the agreement is one that you think is good, don't unravel it with amendments that are going to destroy the agreement. And the prospect of that means that you don't get as high a quality of agreement as you otherwise would get. But how do we deal with the changes? Yes, globalization has absolutely transformed the world. I mean, I suspect that you didn't use a computer in 1989. There's so many things that we didn't do and didn't have 20 years ago. How do we build on the NAFTA? Well, we have a wonderful opportunity with, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We don't have to reopen NAFTA. Our two neighbors are sitting at the table with us. And whatever we agree to in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that changes, upgrades, adds to the NAFTA will be the governing document. So we really want to get on with this and get a really good Asia-Pacific agreement. And my hope is that we can achieve the promise that we made, that we would have a an agreement that covered all of Asia Pacific, all of APEC, all the 21 economies. But this is a first step, and we should make it a good one.
And I suspect that the May 10 concerns that were raised will clearly be part of the TPP negotiating process, and that will, as the ambassador has said, be the vehicle that will allow many of these concerns that Mr. Series and that others have raised to effectively be dealt with.
I'm out of time, I know, but if I had time, I'd ask you about trade adjustments assistance and whether you think that that would fall in. You know, some, I think it's important because some, we've lost, I believe, more jobs because of technological advances than we have because of trade. But I'm out of time, and so I'll leave that for another time.
It's expired, but I will say that I do believe that as we proceed in a bipartisan way, that trade adjustment assistance will continue to need to be part of the process itself.
And I think it's actually helpful because we know that trade creates growth generally, but there are some dislocations. And for our nation, it is very good to have trade adjustment assistance.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Dreyer, welcome back to Congress.
Thank you very much.
You're missed. Your leadership's missed. Your composure and difficult issues are missed. And you were a role model for a lot of us to follow in how you handled yourself as a congressman. So, again, I say welcome back. There are a lot of issues with trade. I met with the members of Parliament that are part of a transatlantic group on terrorism last year, and we discussed TTIP. And they were very interested in seeing that trade agreement move forward at some point. They raised some concerns about agricultural products from the U.S. into Europe. I think that's a challenge that we're going to have. If you want to touch on that, we'll get to that in a second. And then I would like to talk about energy, primarily. This may be for Mr. Farnsworth more than this panel, but with what Mexico is seeing with their energy sector, with the denationalization of the energy sector and Pemex and more competitiveness down there in future years, how do you think the NAFTA countries will benefit from more energy resources here in North America, and how does that apply to trade? And then the last thing I'll mention is with TPP, and I've got to support the textile industry in South Carolina. What we saw with the Korean Free Trade Agreement, the reason I voted against it was the fact that I felt like textiles were sort of thrown to the wolves there at the end of the negotiations and the end of the Bush administration, and were treated unfairly with Korea. So we're very cognizant of what's going on with Vietnam and with dumping and countries of origin with regard to textiles. And then the last thing I'd touch on is we need to make sure that with MTBs, we've got companies like Michelin and Bridgestone that have certain raw materials that are vital to the production of tires in South Carolina. And a lot of times they have to get a miscellaneous tariff benefit change in order to get those raw materials in so that those jobs can be kept in South Carolina and not sent to Brazil or Asia where the resources may be a little more plentiful. So those three things, energy primarily, the textile issue, MTBs, and also agricultural products. If y'all just want to touch on those, and I'll just open it up for you. Ambassador?
Well, we certainly should address the agricultural issues. We have 90% of our subsidies going to 5 commodities: corn, wheat, soy, cotton, and rice. And if nothing goes to string beans or apples, and you hear about all the health foods in the world, but with our economy in the financial state it is in, and the commodity prices being relatively generous, it would be very well that we would be able to address this issue. And Europe, for the same reason, it could move on these issues. That ability to talk about agriculture would get us services put by other countries on the table where we have tremendous competitive advantage. But if you have nothing to put on the table, you're going to get nothing given to you on the table. And so agriculture is absolutely key. When I said we have relatively low tariffs with Europe on products, agriculture is the exception. Agriculture, textiles, glassware, footwear. You take those out and our average tariffs is about 3%. You put those things in and you've got dislocations. And as far as energy goes, you know, inviting Mexico in to TTIP would provide President Pena an umbrella, a talk about a major trade agreement that would help him move forward on his economic reforms that we want him to make. He has put through the energy constitution, but he still has to get legislation. He still has to have regulation. We want him to move forward and liberalize telecommunications. If he were part of the team negotiating to make North America more competitive, it would make all the difference in the world. And that's what Salinas did with the NAFTA. He used that as an umbrella and said, well, folks, look at what I'm getting. So please stay with me. I want this trade agreement, and you will get something for it. I think that this should be part of our strategic thinking.
Let me just add, I don't have an opinion on the MTB issue as it relates to those things, but I will tell you that, Mr. Duncan, I feel very strongly about the so-called pacto, which is the reform that President Peña Nieto has boldly pursued, and he's working, and it's been challenging to bring together the three major political parties in Mexico. But the idea of dealing not only with telecommunications and energy, but labor and education and fiscal reform, those 5 areas, is something that is really groundbreaking. I mean, we've talked about the fact that I hung around this place for more than a couple of years, and if you go back to the 1980s, and you guys are too young to remember that, but I will tell you that I remember very vividly. It's when I started here, and I was younger than you when I started here doing that, but I will say that at that time, the struggles that existed between our two countries were very, very great. And the idea of looking at political reform, the 5 things that I just mentioned within the pacto, the fact that the Woodrow Wilson study the other day pointed to the fact that going back to the 1980s, the average Mexican family lived in a 1-room home. Today, they live in 3-room homes. I mean, there are so many advances that have been made, and I believe that is going to inure to the benefit of your constituents in South Carolina. Why? Because as we see that economy grow, and Mr. Series pointed correctly, we still have very serious poverty problems that exist in Mexico and in the United States. The displacement that Ambassador Hills correctly pointed to is why we need trade adjustment assistance. But I believe that as we see these economies grow, they are going to provide a market. They're going to provide a market for the workers you have in your congressional district, and I think that's something that needs to be remembered. It's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to remain exactly as it is. But, I mean, we believe in the marketplace itself, and, Ronald Reagan really envisaged this on November 6th of 1979 when he announced his candidacy for president. 1979, Ronald Reagan, in that announcement, said that he envisaged an accord of trade among all the Americas. This was part of the Reagan vision that was then implemented by the Bush-Hills team and then passed through the Congress by the Clinton-Cantor team. And I will say that I think that this is going to be a real winner for your constituents as we move ahead with it.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate the testimony. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. That concludes the questions. We'd love to thank our distinguished first panel.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to be able to be back and see you guys.
Thank you. Great pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to change the panels now and have the second panel be seated. Might let the second panel know we've been notified that our vote on the omnibus budget or appropriations bill, is going to take place. It was supposed to be sometime in the last 15 minutes. So if it buzzes and we have to leave, please be patient. We'll be back. It's the last vote of the day and quite an important one. So with that, we'll go ahead and dispense with introductions just to save time. Ask for unanimous consent to go ahead and do that. So without objection. And we'll go ahead and start with you, Ms. Farnsworth.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to you, to the members of the subcommittee, Mr. Sears. It is a real honor to have the opportunity to appear before you again this afternoon. And I do want to reemphasize the fact that this is a continuation as well of the field hearing from Tucson, which was a real success, and it's a particular pleasure as well to join other witnesses today of such prominence and stature. If I may, let me give you what I believe to be the bottom line first. NAFTA was first and foremost an agreement designed to increase trade and investment among its three parties, promote North American economic integration, and support a vision of open market democracy for Mexico, providing that nation with a clear path toward political and economic modernization. On all three priorities, NAFTA has succeeded. As we've already heard, since 1993, U.S. trade in goods and services with Canada and Mexico has increased from $370 billion a year to over $1 trillion today. Annual trade between the United States and Canada has more than doubled. With Mexico, it's more than quadrupled. More than 40 U.S. states count either Mexico or Canada as their top export destination. Perhaps more importantly even than those statistics, however, NAFTA institutionalized a vision for North America that would have been impossible absent significant political and economic reforms in Mexico, and NAFTA both catalyzed such reforms and has also benefited from them. Trade agreements are not just about trade and investment. They are also critical, if often overlooked, tools of U.S. foreign policy. Unquestionably, NAFTA has directly supported Mexico's democratic transformation over the past 20 years, thus contributing to the true partnership that now exists between our two countries. In fact, we are allies in a way that 20 years ago it was almost inconceivable to even consider. It has empowered new constituencies in Mexico and a growing middle class that has demanded and received an increasingly clear political voice. And as we see Mexico's economy generate new opportunities, coupled with the slowdown of the U.S. economy, net migration flows from Mexico have become virtually zero, reducing the temperature on this bilateral irritant. A full accounting of NAFTA's impact, therefore, cannot overlook these very important issues. Since NAFTA was implemented, however, the world has changed dramatically. As a result, the agreement should be modernized, I believe, to expand North American competitiveness. Three trends show why. First, production models have changed, and we've already heard a little bit about that this afternoon. Our three countries don't just trade products together, we now design and make these products together. And that's to our benefit. The statistic has already been used. Let me use it again. Every dollar of U.S. imports from Mexico includes some 40% of U.S. content. From Canada, it's some 25%. So North America is now the production platform. Second, in 1994, there was barely an internet, as Mr. Dreyer said. Nobody had a clue how radically electronic communications would fundamentally alter business models. More broadly, incredible technological advances have transformed virtually every sector in the past 2 decades, from energy, which we've heard about, to healthcare, which we've heard about, to financial services. The list goes on and on. Industries that were not even contemplated by original negotiators are now significant engines of growth. Third, there is a noticeable change in trade patterns within North America demarcated by 9/11, at which point the border thickened and commercial activities understandably took a second seat to security. Still, as NAFTA facilitated trade has increased, infrastructure has generally languished. Our strategic opportunity, therefore, is to capitalize on our increasingly unified North American economic space and dynamism, particularly as Mexico advances along its reform agenda. An agenda for progress that we might consider then would include several elements, in some areas addressing challenges stemming from the original agreement, and in others taking note of changes in the North American production model and finding ways to facilitate and enhance such activities. As a first step, we need to find a way to get the greatest efficiencies from the agreement as it currently exists, from trucking regulations to intellectual property protections to customs and regulatory harmonization to border infrastructure. These are not easy issues. Some have been with us since the agreement was concluded. Some require additional funding. At the same time, were the original agreement to be negotiated today, it likely would not look the same. For example, it would have to incorporate the incredible advances in energy that are making North America self-sufficient, improving our terms of trade while igniting a manufacturing renaissance. It would highlight and promote the rapid growth in services and newer industries like biotech that has occurred in the past generation, including the information technology revolution and cloud computing. It might incorporate some categories of labor mobility. It would seek ways to safely increase border throughput as a strategic economic issue for the entire United States, not just border states. And it would attempt to find effective ways to address rule of law issues, as former President Cedillo has written recently, are perhaps Mexico's most vexing challenge. We've talked a little bit about Canada. It also applies to Mexico. More broadly, the NAFTA bloc should be viewed as the basis for a more strategic trade policy generally. Mexican and Canadian entry into TPP was critical, and we've talked about that already. Now, to take advantage of economies of scale, we should also negotiate together with Mexico and Canada the free trade agreement with the European Union. And similarly, and I don't think we've talked about this quite yet today, an early economic association among North American and Pacific Alliance nations, which include Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, would be both timely and appropriate. The upcoming leaders meeting that we've talked about in Mexico will offer an opportunity to take stock of North America and to begin a process that builds on NAFTA while even updating it further. The leaders should commit to annual trilateral meetings, designating a senior official to promote progress in the interim. They should commit to a process that includes the private sector, whereby the unrealized gains from NAFTA can be identified and addressed, and those lessons learned from the agreement can be directly applied elsewhere. And they should begin a dialogue with the leaders of the Pacific Alliance and other nations in the Hemisphere that will advance discussions on hemispheric economic integration, even as the Summit of the Americas has lost its primary economic focus. Given changed circumstances both within North America and outside the region in larger emerging markets such as China and India and others, it's time to have another look to determine where further progress can be made. Mr. Chairman, I really want to thank you again for this opportunity. I've appreciated it. I look forward to your questions. Mr. Series, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Farnsworth. Mr. Elliott.
Thank you, Chairman Salmon. Thank you, Chairman Salmon and Ranking Member Series. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce appreciates your leadership and the opportunity to testify on IP matters associated with NAFTA today. From the outset, I would like to state that the NAFTA has succeeded spectacularly in boosting cross-border trade, economic growth, and creating good jobs. It has proven to be one of the most effective and beneficial trade agreements in U.S. history. As we celebrate the triumph of NAFTA on its 20th anniversary, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce calls upon elected officials and business leaders in Canada, Mexico, and the United States to build upon this foundation in the years ahead. One area where particular focus is needed is that of intellectual property. At the time of signing, NAFTA included IP language that was of a high standard. However, since the agreement was signed, 20 years has passed, and this level of intellectual property protection now represents a very low bar by 2014 standards. In the past 2 years, we have highlighted industry concerns with the Canadian and Mexican IP environments through the USTR Special 301 process. In 2012, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce released an international IP index, which was the first ever comprehensive review of national IP environments covering 11 key markets. The United States and the United Kingdom and Australia all performed well in this regard. On the other hand, Mexico and Canada were more closely linked to Russia, Malaysia, and China. In Mexico, we have seen some forward progression in recent years. The business community has been working well with the Mexican government. In contrast, Canada's relatively low score results in wide-ranging IP problems and a distinct lack of action from the Canadian government. It is fair to say that industry is more concerned with the IP environment in Canada than in Mexico. And I'd like to provide a few specific examples of some of the Canadian issues. Firstly, WTO TRIPS and NAFTA require patents to be granted for inventions that are new, non-obvious, and useful. And this is also known as patent utility. Over the past 8 years, the Canadian courts have used this clause to revoke more than 20 pharmaceutical patents for what they call lack of utility or usefulness. They justify doing so by requiring evidence that is wholly inappropriate for judicial review of patent approvals. In one instance, an innovative pharmaceutical company lost $500 million in revenue. This trend is not happening anywhere else in the world. Secondly, and unlike other countries, Canada is yet to provide ex officio authority to its custom officials to seize counterfeit and pirated products at the border. Thirdly, the business community is concerned with the ongoing and substantial illicit trafficking of goods across the US-Canadian border. Counterfeiting and piracy in Canada are worth approximately $20 to $30 billion annually. This includes sporting goods, medicines, consumer electronics, automotive parts. The list is endless. Many of these counterfeits originate from China, and the criminal organizations see Canada as the easiest entry point into North America. Fourthly, If a pharmaceutical patent is successfully challenged by a generic manufacturer, the patent holder has no administrative right of appeal. However, if the patent holder is successful in defending the patent, the generic manufacturer is entitled to administrative appeal. This practice is discriminatory against the innovative companies. Lastly, Canada has failed to ratify the WIPO copyright and the WIPO performances and phonographs treaties, resulting in Canada falling below global standards of copyright. As mentioned, 2014 will present many opportunities for the United States, Canada and Mexico to further improve their IP environments. As the committee is well aware, the TPP has been negotiated between 12 countries, and it is essential that it include a robust IP chapter. We would also encourage the Canadian government to work closely with the business community to address specific IP issues within and outside the TPP and NAFTA frameworks, and to raise their IP standards to levels consistent with the United States, the UK, and Australia. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Dr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great pleasure to be here. I always like to say that I'm the perfect NAFTA citizen. I lived and was educated in Canada. I then moved to Mexico, where I worked for 17 years. I then have moved here to the United States. I have a Canadian ex-wife, not because of any intellectual property dispute, let me add. My children were born in Mexico but live in Canada, and I am now married to an American and living and working here. So, but I'm a citizen of none of the three countries, so I guess that makes me the perfect person to comment. A lot has been said about the success of NAFTA. I'd like to talk about the potential of the North American region and what we need to do to realize that potential. I think that we see four main factors in the potential for North America. The fully integrated production platform is something that we've talked about at great length already, and I think we need to emphasize that. It's very, very important to see that we are unique in the world in the way that industry in the three countries works together. Second factor has already been mentioned, energy. North America's incredible energy abundance, from the massive hydroelectric resources and oil sands of Canada to the huge oil and gas reserves of the Gulf of Mexico, shale gas and tight oil fields onshore, and the world-class wind, solar, and geothermal resources of Mexico and the United States, means that the region's energy security is guaranteed for the foreseeable future. But it's the cost of energy that gives us the real advantage in the world. The shale gas revolution has meant that gas prices and therefore the cost of electricity are incredibly low by international standards, conferring a huge boost to the cost efficiency of North American manufacturing. The third factor is human capital. North America has a demographic profile that gives it a significant long-term advantage over Europe, China, and Japan. The openness of Canada and the United States to immigration has allowed these countries to maintain a steady supply of young people who provide a workforce that satisfy labor needs. Mexico's traditionally higher fertility rate has meant that it's been a source country for many of these young people, but its changing demographic pattern now means that it will produce less migrants than in years gone by. So we have to take advantage of the demographic bonus while it exists. The challenge is, how do we invest in the region's young people? The final factor is the internal market. We have 460 million people in the North American economic space, and that their spending power combined exceeds that of any other nation or region. Total North American GDP will rise from $19 trillion today to over $50 trillion by 2050, when the regional population is forecast to top 630 million, and Mexico is projected to be one of the world's 5 largest economies. Mexico, with its relatively young population, a rising middle class, and with economic growth rates expected to surpass those in Canada and the United States, will generate the lion's share of North American growth. This will ensure that the domestic market in North America remains the most important in the world, even after Chinese GDP outgrows that of the United States. So what do we need to do to guarantee the economic future? First, we need to modernize and deepen North American integration. As has been mentioned here, NAFTA was a first-generation trade agreement signed in another era. We need to update it to take into consideration all of the new products that have been mentioned here. We need to strengthen our already considerable attributes if the region is going to be able to compete against other countries and regions of the world. Harmonizing regulations and standards, introducing agreements on services, and coordinating economic policy more closely will do just that. Second, we must invest in our people to ensure that employers have the human talent they need to remain competitive. We need to give them the freedom to move in the region. Third, we need to invest in our borders, in both infrastructure and in procedures, to ensure that integrated production processes in the region are efficient, agile, and competitive. Fourth, we need to invest in energy infrastructure so that we create a fully integrated North American energy market that will ensure supply and keep prices low. Finally, we need to think about how a strong North America can best engage with the rest of the world. The potential of the TPP is considerable, but the negotiations must take into consideration the interests, strengths, and weaknesses of all three NAFTA partners. This means that we have to think not only about those who win from openness and free trade, but also those who lose. How do we compensate those who lose their jobs or whose businesses cannot compete in a globalized economy? Though it's a thorny issue, this question must be answered adequately if we are to maintain political support for free markets, trade, and investment. I'm an optimist on this one, and I agree with Fred Bergston, who has estimated that the benefits to the U.S. economy of 50 years of free trade equal around $1 trillion in annual GDP, and that the benefits outweigh the costs by about 20 to 1. Now is the moment for the United States, Mexico, and Canada to celebrate open regionalism and to take the necessary measures to make sure that our shared regional economy is strong enough to compete on the world stage. The TPP is one path, but we must recognize that there are also encouraging signs at last from the World Trade Organization after 12 years of stagnation. If we take the necessary measures, we can not only enjoy a more prosperous future, but also offer an example that the rest of the world may follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to recess the subcommittee so that we can go vote on the floor, and we'll be back to ask questions. Thank you.
What do you think the chances of him coming back are? Zero?
He has a meeting. Sorry.
It's okay.
Did as long as he could.
Yeah, you did.
No, yeah. I'm going to head back to my office.
Okay. You did.
From there.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're going to the Canadian thing, right? Are you?
I'm planning on it.
All right, we'll reconvene the subcommittee. And I'd like to start off the questioning first with Mr. Farnsworth. How has NAFTA affected the trade balance between the three countries? How do energy imports affect the trade balance, and will Mexico's energy reforms have implications for the trade in energy?
Well, thank you, sir, for the opportunity. The trade balance is a factor of many things, not just NAFTA. And so a lot of times people say, well, after we passed NAFTA, the trade balance changed overnight almost, it seemed, in 1994. That was a result of the peso crisis, et cetera. So at one level, it's a difficult linkage to make. What NAFTA did was it opened up both economies to each other. Clearly, energy is actually a part of that, and one of the things that we often hear in terms of NAFTA as a criticism is that the U.S. trade balance with Mexico has changed into the negative. Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that, frankly, we're importing from Mexico energy. We're also importing a lot, obviously, from Canada, which is our #1 supplier of energy, and so those energy relationships would occur with or without NAFTA. So I think we just have to be a little bit careful there in that context. But as energy reforms go through in Mexico, we think this is a game changer for several reasons. Number one is because we've talked a little bit about the cost of energy. Energy right now in Mexico, electricity in particular, is really expensive. And from a manufacturing perspective, that's a very important input. As the cost of energy decreases, manufacturing is going to be a lot more competitive. And that builds into the entire idea we've all been talking about North America as a production platform. But you're also going to have huge opportunities for U.S. investors for the first time since 1938 to have the opportunity perhaps to work directly with the Mexican energy sector. And you're also going to have opportunities for U.S. technology and U.S. capital to be deployed. And this is really important because particularly in the context of natural gas, which Mexico has an awful lot of but hasn't been able to develop because they haven't had the technology and capital. These are in some ways environmentally sensitive issues, and you have to have best practices, you have to have cutting-edge technology, you have to know what you're doing or else you can really make a mess of things. That's U.S. technology. The U.S. is in the lead here, and so to deploy that technology in the Mexican energy sector we think is a very good thing. So that's going to contribute very directly to the trade balance because, frankly, those are exports. Also, I have to say that'll also contribute to Canada's trade balance. Those will be exports from Canada, too. Canada is a very robust energy sector. I would very quickly also just align myself with your comments about the XL pipeline. I think that's a very important thing. And I also want to congratulate Congress, in fact, as well, moving forward with the transboundary hydrocarbon agreement with Mexico.
Thank you very much. Mr. Elliott, as I mentioned earlier, I have some grave concerns about some of the IP infractions in Canada. And you focused a large part of your testimony on the same issue. I find it very disconcerting that they have appeared on USTR's watch list that singles out country where IPR is inconsistent, really consistently for the last 20 years. They've been on that list. Where's the best mechanism for us to try to address it? To me, it is a very, very serious concern. And if we're going to look at new trade agreements, maybe that's where they should be raised, or should they be maybe raised through the existing trade agreement, or what are your thoughts? Because I'm not going to let it go. Thank you.
Sure. And thank you, Chairman Salmon, for not letting it go. It's a very important issue to the business community. I think there are a couple of parts to this. If you break out the patent utility piece itself, there are a number of different ways you can tackle that one. If the Canadian government don't see an obligation through NAFTA to fix it, then there's certainly, you would imagine there's an obligation through the EU-Canada CETA agreement to fix it. If not, there will certainly be through the TPP. And if not, it's been spelt out over a number of years for the Special 301 process. It's quite clear what the problem is. The frustrating aspect of this is that in the US, Europe and Canada, the law is virtually the same. There is just a very minor clause in there which makes the difference. And in the US and Europe, it's defining the area as capable of industrial application, and the Canadian law says lack of utility. They're the differences in the wording of the legislation. It's a relatively easy fix. My view is that there are a number of different mechanisms here to put some pressure on the Canadian government to act on this. I would hope that the Canadian government would see the need to address it for their own purposes, and quite simply, it's the right thing to do.
I find it kind of incredulous that some of these Canadian generic companies would want to offer a product that has no utility.
Yes, indeed. Part of the irony here is that, of course, the patent is that the court finds that the patent has no utility. Then, of course, the generic entrant enters the market, proving, of course, there was utility after all.
I guess that's how they keep the cost of medicine down. You know, in your statement, Mr. Elliott, you said that China sends the counterfeit through Canada, through here, and how much was it that you estimate a year that comes through the United States through Canada?
There's somewhere between 20 and 30 million through Canada. 20 and 30 billion a year in the counterfeit business running through Canada at the moment.
And that just gets passed on to us?
Not all of it. Not all of it. Some of that would. Some would remain in Canada.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
But a lot of it comes to us.
That's correct. And look,
and we don't. What about our border checks or anything like that? Doesn't that come into play?
Yeah. Look, there's a couple of aspects on this. I mean, I think there's an issue around the counterfeits entering Canada. And I think that's the ex officio issue here, where the law enforcement people don't have the authority without a court order to seize goods coming through. There was a former Canadian ambassador to the United States who wrote that it's more difficult to transport a used mattress across the border on top of your car than a truckload of counterfeit products into the U.S. And there is some truth in that. Look, and some of this is, of course, not solely on Canada. There's an issue here on the U.S. side. But part of the frustration here, I think, is that to some extent the Canadian government is not inspecting some of the materials coming from China that they believe are en route to the U.S. And then, of course, when it enters the U.S. authorities are perhaps not applying the same sort of attention to it, feeling that it's coming from Canada, and therefore not requiring the same level of attention as it would if it were coming directly from Canada, from China.
Dr. Wood, how do labor and environment provisions in recent free trade agreements and reportedly in the TPP differ from those of NAFTA?
Thank you. I think we're in a crucial moment in the TPP negotiations where we're seeing the pushback on certain environmental and labor negotiations. We were fortunate enough within NAFTA to be able to create these side agreements that actually did help to raise standards in Mexico in particular. We also developed an institution at the border, the North American Development Bank, that sought to develop the border region in an environmentally safe way to improve drinking water, paving. Now they're moving on into renewable energy and emissions, which are very, very important features of industrialization. That was something which is added into the NAFTA sort of after the fact, after the negotiations, but it became a crucial element. I think we probably could do a lot more on that in NAFTA. What I am concerned about with TPP is that we need to make sure that those standards remain high. As the piece that was published in the New York Times this morning highlighted, at the moment it seems as though the United States is backing off from an insistence on high environmental and labor standards in that agreement. It's an issue that is important not just in the sense of protecting jobs here, but also in making sure that the development of those countries, because ultimately that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the development of those markets around the Pacific Basin as an outlet for U.S. goods. Their development needs to be sustainable in every sense of the word. And so I think that's a concern that needs to be there front and center. It needs to be an issue that U.S. negotiators have a strong stance on.
Thank you. Mr. Farnsworth, how come we have such large deficits with some of these countries? And we have this trade agreement.
Well, again, sir, it's a really good question because it's asked all the time. And the deficit itself is an accounting mechanism that isn't necessarily linked directly to trade agreements or not. I mean, this is a much broader number, if you will, and it's the flip side of investment numbers, et cetera, as you would know from economics. But having said that, what trade agreements have done, and it was said in the previous panel, is open foreign markets that were previously closed to the United States in a way that is done on a reciprocal basis. And this is oftentimes really important because the United States has generally given unilateral trade access or trade preferences to our trade partners traditionally, and the trade agreements actually what they do is they give us equal access to those foreign markets that we haven't had in the past. And so if we want to increase our exports, we got to find ways to open new markets. And that's precisely what we've seen, at least in the Western Hemisphere, where I know the stories much better, in terms of bilateral agreements with Chile, the bilateral agreements with Peru, the bilateral agreement with Colombia, with CAFTA, the Central American countries, and it's also what we've seen in terms of NAFTA. Now, the issue with Mexico right after the agreement went into force was, again, I mentioned it very briefly, but the peso devaluation, which changed the terms of trade, but that wasn't specifically related to NAFTA. In fact, it was NAFTA that locked Mexico into a course of activity that prevented them from doing things that they might have done previously, as they did in the 1980s, to close their markets. And what NAFTA did is it kept those markets open, and as a direct result, Mexico returned to global capital markets in a matter of months, whereas during the crisis of the 1980s, it took them years to get back. So, in fact, NAFTA was a framework that really has helped contain the damage, but also gave Mexico a ladder to get out of it. Now, that doesn't guarantee that every policy action every country takes is going to be favorable or not have negative consequences, or frankly that the trade agreement is going to be able to ameliorate every bad thing that happens. But that's one way to look at some of these issues, and I think a very helpful way.
Our latest trade agreement with Colombia, how is that working? You want to?
Yeah, I mean, the information that I have on the trade agreement with Colombia is that it's working quite well for the United States, but not so well for Colombian exporters. They haven't been able to take advantage of the terms of that agreement in the same way as the United States has, and it's.
They also signed a trade agreement with Canada, right? Totaling $7 billion.
I believe they did. Yes.
Yeah. They have. So.
But I think that one thing is that we're at the fortunate point of view or perspective of 20 years of NAFTA. We can look back. The free trade agreement with Colombia is still relatively new. They take time to mature, and I think adopting a longer term historical perspective is crucial in this question. Just with your question to Eric Farnsworth just now, Mexico is on this development path where ultimately their terms of trade are going to change. They will start to import a lot more from the United States, just as they have done already. We've seen the transformation of the Mexican economy. So they import a lot more than they used to. And trade matters a lot more to Mexico than it did 20 years ago. Back then, trade as a percentage of GDP was at 30%. Now we're looking at a 70% of GDP related to trade. That's a huge transformation for the country.
If I can make just a very quick comment on Colombia to add to what Duncan was saying, the real winner in terms of the Colombia trade agreement has been the United States because, again, this was an agreement that Colombia had unilateral free market access into the United States through the original Indian Trade Preference Act from 1991. That was later extended and expanded into the ATP-DEA in the year 2000. But that was always unilateral access that the Colombians enjoyed into the United States. What the U.S. didn't have was reciprocal access into Colombia, and that's what the FTA has granted us. Now, the Colombian FTA has only been in operation for a short period of time, and it always gives me a chuckle when you hear the opponents of trade agreements particularly talk about difficulties in, for example, the Colombian agriculture sector, and they blame the trade agreement with the United States. But the terms of implementation of the agriculture provisions in the trade agreement haven't gone into effect yet, because they've been backloaded in terms of transition periods, just like we did with NAFTA over a 15-year period. So you get all these, complaints sometimes about agreements when, in fact, the agreement isn't even operative in those sectors. So Colombia, I think, is a country that we're going to see increasing dynamism. And what the exciting thing has been for that particular country is they're actually seeing the trade agreements with Canada and the United States and now with the Pacific Alliance and some of the interesting things they're doing in the Pacific, not as the end point, but as the beginning point, the access point to the global economy that then allows them to take the domestic reforms they need to on labor rights and on the environment and on education, on innovation, all the things we know so well, and use the trade agreement as really a spur to those broader national development goals. And ultimately, I think that's where the people of Colombia want to go, and I think that's where the United States would want them to go as well.
And the South Korea trade agreement, how is that doing?
I'm not an expert there, I'm sorry.
Okay. Anybody?
Don't know.
Okay, well, guess we can end it on that.
All right, well, that concludes our questions. We'd really like to thank the second panel very, very much for your, taking your time, and sorry about the hiatus that we just had to endure, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I don't have any other comments or questions. I'm actually very, very encouraged that NAFTA has been a very, very phenomenal success and a success that we can build upon with other FTAs. So thank you very much, and this hearing is concluded. Thanks, buddy. Thanks.
We have 3 of the 5 eyes here. He's a Canadian here, and a Kiwi, and then we can, we can talk NSA. Yeah.